I will remember this phrase forever. He said, because it is a thing of fire.
Oh.
It's one of the very few traditions of a global flood that destroys a former civilization. As I say, there's up to 200 of them. It's one of the only ones which actually gives a date.
So are you getting to some sort of more true proto-architecture to religion that involves these sort of oral traditions passed down that cuts across geography?
Look, these were secret societies which were entrusted with preserving information from what they call the first time and passing it down to future generations.
That represents such a precocious, advanced astronomical knowledge. That's macro, it's cosmic scale knowledge.
Yeah.
That we just don't have today.
It's not just life after death. It's this leap to the Milky Way. It's this journey through what is called, it's called an underworld, but it's also in the sky. It was just an intriguing story. And it wasn't my main focus in the 1980s, but it was something I gradually built up information on till I got to a point where I knew I had a book to
What's
write.
the town that the Ark of the Covenant is?
Axum.
Axum.
AXUM, and it's in the province of Tigray, in northern Ethiopia. And there's we need not go into it in detail, but there's a whole long tradition in Ethiopia. Actually, Ethiopia is the only country in the world that claims to have the Ark of the Covenant.
Yes.
There are lots of rumors, traditions, suggestions that it might be in Jordan, that it might be hidden beneath the Temple Mount, in Jerusalem, in all kinds of places. But there's one country in the world where it's a living tradition and where it's central, oddly, to Christianity in Ethiopia, because it's a pre-Christian relic, but it's central to Ethiopian Christianity. And they have their own story about how the Ark of the Covenant got there. But actually it was, as I began to research this subject and encountered the very interesting community of indigenous Ethiopian Jews who are known as the Falashas. They call themselves the Beta Israel, the House of Israel.
Lost tribe.
They have a very ancient presence in Ethiopia, and they have their own story about how the Ark of the Covenant got to Ethiopia. And it's quite different from the Ethiopian national epic, which is called the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings. Their story is much, much more interesting and is clearly factually based for all kinds of reasons, like how their ancestors had fled from Israel carrying the Ark, like how they brought it to an island in the Nile River and kept it there for several hundred years, like how they were forced out and fled south following the Blue Nile to its source in Lake Tana, which is where the Falasha communities still live today. Now, actually, when I say still live today, during the chaos of the overthrow of the Mengistu regime in Ethiopia in 1991, Israel flew in many, many large cargo planes and actually airlifted out of Ethiopia the majority of the Ethiopian Jews and resettled them in Israel. Quite a number have returned, but there's still a large Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel itself now. And they just have fascinating stories about this, and stories that make sense, and stories that I was able to tie up with historical evidence. So, I gradually began to feel that this claim that Ethiopia makes may have a real basis to it. And obviously that involved me figuring out what this thing is. It's the first time that I began to get a sense of something missing in the human story. Because the Ark of the Covenant does sound, there's a very detailed description of it in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, in the Old Testament. And that description is like a blueprint for a device, which supposedly God gives to Moses on Mount Sinai.
And it directs the Israelites where to go when they're in the desert?
Yes, as they carry it through the desert, it's carried in procession before them. It becomes central to the way. And of course it contains the tablets of the Ten Commandments, according to the book of Exodus. But also it strikes people dead with bolts of fire that come out of it. It can cause whole populations to suffer from cancerous tumors, as it did when the Philistines, as they're called in the Bible, briefly captured it. They all died, so bad that they had to return it to the Israelites.
Which is fascinating, because you say that the guards that are guarding it in Axum currently seem to have radiation damage in certain cases. They have cataracts.
They all have cataracts over their eyes, and by and large, once they are appointed guardian of the Ark, they have a lifespan of about 3 years. And they all say, because I've interviewed a number of them in succession, when the previous one has died, I've gone back, found a new guy there. And he said, yeah, my predecessor died, and the Ark did it. And he shows me the cataracts over his eyes, and he says, the Ark is doing this to me. And I said, why? And I will remember this phrase forever. He said, because it is a thing of fire.
Oh, and you said you almost went in there, but you were very afraid.
Well, no, I was not allowed to go.
You weren't allowed to
I was allowed through the gates in front of the sanctuary chapel in which the Ethiopians claim it's kept, but I wasn't allowed into the
I think I asked you, why didn't you sneak in, Graham? And you said, you said something very interesting to me, though. You said, something inside of me said I wasn't ready and it would be dangerous.
I felt it would be obnoxious to try and sneak in. It would be wrong. You know, I have to respect the sanctity of this place. And besides, the people of Aksum are well prepared to defend it. Were anybody to try to break into that chapel, they would be shot. It's as simple as that.
Did you know, if it's just been an Aksum all along, you had, you know, Heinrich Himmler under Hitler looking for these, you know, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant. Did he ever try to go to Aksum and take it from them?
During the Italian occupation of Ethiopia, which was roughly 1935 to 1941, the Ethiopians say that they took the Ark out of Aksum and they took it to another place of safekeeping. That's their story. They took it to an island on Lake Zwei, which is south of Addis Ababa. I wouldn't be surprised if there were efforts to find it, but the Ethiopians have been very competent at frustrating those efforts for a very long time. Anyway, it's a fascinating story, and it led me down a track that I hadn't expected to find myself going down. And it led me down that track of what else is missing in our past, and why are archaeologists so arrogant? Because they arrogantly and sneeringly dismissed the Ethiopian tradition. Whereas at a heart level, when I encountered Ethiopians who were connected to this story, I found people with a deep commitment and faith to it, and solid reasoning why it should be there. So that probably was the first time I began to wonder whether archaeologists are entirely trustworthy, and certainly began to feel that if I'm researching any subject to do with the ancient past, I will not rely only on what archaeologists have to say.
That's beautiful. So you realized there was something more true about your firsthand experience.
Definitely, yeah, absolutely. And that's my approach to researching any subject, is that I have to be there in person. I have to have boots on the ground. I have to have strong local investigation going on. I can't just rely on books and what so-called experts tell me.
Shifting to the pyramids of Giza, you say they're not just a tomb.
Well, not only they're not a tomb.
They're not a tomb.
Again, I'm in conflict with archaeology here, but I'm certainly not the only one, because the notion that the Great Pyramid is a tomb and only a tomb, which is what archaeology teaches, in my view, is absurd. It's well known that no burial of any pharaoh was ever found in the Great Pyramid, or for that matter, in any of the 100 pyramids in Egypt. Some of that can be down to tomb robbery, but in the case of the Great Pyramid, it was completely closed and sealed until Arab raiders under Caliph Mamun broke in to the Great Pyramid, and they found it empty. They were expecting to find enormous treasures and wealth, and instead they found it a completely empty building with nothing inside it at all. Of course, there are many other unexplored areas of the Great Pyramid. Remote scanning is now showing that there are huge, as yet uninvestigated cavities within the Great Pyramid, huge chambers. The best known feature of the Great Pyramid inside is the Grand Gallery, and it looks like there's a second Grand Gallery above it within the pyramid. That shows up in scanning. Nobody's been able to get in there yet, but it's not going to be an impossible technological feat to do so. I think rather than being at the end of the study of the Great Pyramid, I think we're just at the beginning of the study of the Great Pyramid. And little by little, if we are worthy, it will reveal its secrets to us. I think that's what it's intended to do. But it's not a tomb. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. For very, very simple reasons. When you know that monument, when you see it, when you confront its 6 million tons, when you confront its incredible precision, when you confront the already known corridors and passageways within it, the notion that this was built in 23 years is absurd. And yet, if the notion that it is the tomb of Khufu is correct, and if that's all it is, then it had to be built in 23 years, because that was the length of his reign. I regard that as impossible. And anybody with structural engineering experience, like my great friend Robert Boval, also regard it as impossible. More likely, it's a project that took hundreds of years to complete, and maybe thousands. I think that there's no doubt that parts of the Great Pyramid were completed and finished by the ancient Egyptians. I don't seek to take it away from the ancient Egyptians, but I think they were inheriting a very ancient tradition, and they were completing a monument that already stood in basic form on the Giza Plateau. I felt from the beginning that the three ground platforms on which the three Great Pyramids stand are far older than the pyramids themselves, and they represent an epoch that the ancient Egyptians called Zep-Tepi, the first time. And they do so astronomically. They do so in terms of astronomical connection to Orion's belt, just as the Great Sphinx does so in terms of the connection to the rising sun on the equinox, which at one time was housed by the constellation of Leo. And that moment when the three stars of Orion's belt are due south on the meridian at dawn on the spring equinox is also precisely the moment that the Great Sphinx is looking at the constellation of Leo, 12,500 years ago, not 4,500 years ago. 4,500 years ago, the stars of Orion's belt don't match up. And 4,500 years ago, the Great Sphinx was looking at the sun rising against the background of the constellation of Taurus. But we have a lion-bodied monument representing a celestial figure that we call the constellation of Leo, and that many ancient cultures called the constellation of Leo. And of course, immediately, huge argument from Egyptologists, from archaeologists who say, no, the Greeks or the Babylonians, late Babylonians, discovered the constellations of the zodiac. Nobody had recognized them before that. Complete bullshit, complete rubbish. Ancient cultures exposed to the drama of the skies in a way that we are not, couldn't possibly have failed to observe the 12 zodiacal constellations, which happen to be the constellations that lie on the path of the sun. If you observe the annual course of the sun, you will see during the months of the year that it rises against the background of each one of those constellations. But over a much longer period, when your marker is the spring equinox, you find that it's going backwards through the zodiac. And it gives us a very precise way of astronomically dating a time that was very important to the ancient Egyptians. Again, I think it's important for people to get this, that it is impossible to use, it's possible to use megalithic architecture, which is going to endure forever. You know, there's that saying that time fears the pyramids, because they just last on forever. And to use astronomy to spell out a date very precisely, and that's what happens at Giza. We have many other monuments all over the world which may have been built. The example I usually give is one of the Gothic cathedrals in Europe, built in the 12 or 1300s. But much of the symbolism is devoted to the age of Abraham, which takes you back, Ur of the Chaldees, to about 2000 BC. So the notion that a monument might choose to memorialize a very ancient date doesn't have to mean that that monument was built at that ancient date. It can be referring to that ancient date and saying, to us, the ancient Egyptians, that date was very important. And I'd be willing to stop there if it wasn't for the erosion patterns on the Sphinx. Yeah. Which
water damage on the
water damage, the exposure of the Sphinx to thousands of years of heavy rainfall. That was no such rains were on the Giza Plateau 4,500 years ago, but they certainly will when you go back to the end of the last ice age. So it looks to me like the Sphinx and the megalithic temples beside it, the so-called Valley Temple, the mortuary temples on the Giza Plateau. There are elements on the Giza Plateau, in my view. It's much better to come to the conclusion that they were actually made 12,500 years ago. And there are other elements which are memorializing the date of 12,500 years ago.
The implications of what you're saying are profound, because the procession is a 26,000 year process.
Yeah, that's right.
And for a culture that we now consider primitive, I agree with you, I think it clearly was not at all primitive. No. But to understand the vernal equinox.
Let's be clear on that. No way on God's earth can we call the ancient Egyptians primitive?
Well, we can't build what they built, so there's
And this was a highly sophisticated culture, and it was a culture as it emerges into historical recognition, as it becomes what they call archaeologically visible around 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago. It's already fully evolved. They're doing their best stuff right at the beginning, and they are from the beginning memorializing much more ancient times. Zep Tepi, the first time, which I and my colleagues think correlates closely with the date that we call 12,500 years ago, or 10,500 BC.
But if what you're saying about the Sphinx and the pyramids are correct, and that the Sphinx was, for example, actually meant to depict Leo, which was the constellation which represented the vernal equinox shift around that period, that represents such a precocious, advanced astronomical knowledge that's macro, it's cosmic scale knowledge that we just don't have today.
It's knowledge that requires scientific observation over a long period of time, particularly when you're actually going to create a marker of that on the ground. And I think it's really important that I pay tribute to Robert Bauval, because it's Robert Bauval, close friend of mine, great colleague of mine. Unfortunately, he's been very ill for the last several years. But Robert is the person who established and found the Orion correlation theory, for which he came into such vicious and vile attacks from Egyptologists, simply for noticing that the pattern of the three pyramids on the ground resembles the pattern of the three stars of Orion's belt, and then tracking back through precession to find the time when it actually absolutely matches. And that's about 12,500 years ago. And Robert and I worked together on the whole mystery of the Sphinx, but I would not be here in any way able to talk about the Orion correlation if it had not been for the absolutely fundamental foundational work of Robert Bauval. And I finish this by saying I also want to pay tribute to Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University, geologist, professor of geology, one of the few mainstream academics who's been willing to stick his neck out and say, as a geologist, when I look at the weathering patterns on this monument, it's not 4,500 years old. It's more like 12,500 years old. Again, Robert Schoch has come in for horrendous attacks from the archaeological community. But he's had the guts to stick it out. And before him, John Anthony West, who's passed away in 2018. It was John who first brought Robert Schoch to the Giza Plateau. So the ideas I'm expressing now have a lineage. And I may be the person who's writing them down. But they're not ideas that I've invented. Due tribute to Zahi, he is undoubtedly spent his entire working life focused on the archaeology of the Giza Plateau and on the archaeology of Egypt in general. This is a man with an enormous amount of experience in this field. This is a man who has had access to every important structure and monument in ancient Egypt. In other words, he is a fountain of knowledge on the subject. And I don't want to dismiss fountains of knowledge. I want to see what I can learn from Zahi. And I hope that he might learn something from me as well. And we might end up in a place where there is respectful disagreement, and we can openly discuss the mysteries of the past. That's what I would hope to get to.
That sounds beautiful. Have you ever seen the movie Stargate?
Long time ago.
Kurt Russell movie.
Yeah.
You know,
I have seen it.
There's a portal.
Yeah.
It's near the pyramids of Giza.
Yeah.
But I look at a lot of your work, and when it comes to the pyramids themselves lining up with Orion's Belt has always, across many cultures, been the place of ascension of souls.
Absolutely. It is here in North America, and in Central America, and in South America. The path of souls, that idea that on death our soul makes a kind of leap up to the heavens and then makes a journey along the Milky Way, and that journey is full of challenges and difficulties, on which we will be assessed for the use we made of the incredible gift of life. That idea is found all over the world. It's a universal idea, and it's one of the reasons why I propose that there's been a forgotten episode in human history, that we are looking at a legacy of an idea that was passed down to many later cultures from a remote common ancestor, going back to the end of the last
And
Ice Age.
even if you look at the king's shaft lines up with Orion, and the queen's shaft lines up with Sirius, right?
Yeah.
So it's this really interesting, precise alignment with constellations that
the shafts of the king's chamber don't point at Orion, but one of the shafts of the queen's chamber does.
Okay. And but
let's be clear.
Yeah.
No king was ever buried in that chamber. These are all modern names that have been given by Egyptologists to these chambers to manifest their theory about why there's so many chambers inside the Great Pyramid. But we have no idea what the ancient Egyptians or anybody else ever called them in the past.
Do you have a best guess as to what these were ritualistically used for, given their alignment?
Given the intense focus of the ancient Egyptians on the mystery of life after death, on the mystery of life and on the mystery of death, actually, what happens to us. Most modern scientists of a very so-called rational persuasion who believe that everything can be solved with weighing, measuring, and counting, will tell you, almost as though it's an absolute fact, that they've somehow established through experimentation that the soul, there is no such thing as the soul, and that it does not survive death. Of course, this is not a fact. This is a statement of a religious belief on the part of those scientists who view any such thing as mystical and nonsense. There is no experiment that could be done. Frankly, it's a mystery. None of us know. None of us know. None of us have a clue what happens. Maybe the so-called rational scientists are right. Maybe we are just meat robots, meaninglessly living out our existence here on Earth, producing and consuming. Maybe that's all we are. It could be, but I don't think it is. And the ancient our society pays no attention to these mysteries. The ancient Egyptians, that was their focus for 3,000 years, and they came to very, very, very definite conclusions about it. And those conclusions, I think, are very deep and very weighty and worth considering. And it's fascinating that the same idea is found all around the world. I get it why many different cultures might believe in life after death. The argument for that is people delude them, the rational scientists' argument for that is people delude themselves into believing there's life after death because they don't like the idea of coming to an end. But it's much more specific than that. It's not just life after death. It's this leap to the Milky Way. It's this journey through what is called, it's called an underworld, but it's also in the sky. It's this journey through it. It's the challenges and ordeals that the soul will face along the way, where he or she will be held to account for the life they have lived, for that very specific set of notions to turn up all around the world. That's not an accident. That is a result, I believe, of a shared common influence. This is something else that archaeologists, I think, don't really get. I think what's missing is an archaeology of ideas, and that ideas can live and can be passed on through stories, through traditions, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and they can remanifest again and again. So you can get cultures that are separated by not just thousands of years, but also thousands of miles, who are still manifesting these ideas. For example, the ancient Maya in Central America, and we go into this in one of the episodes of season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse, with a great archaeologist who doesn't hate me, you know, he agrees that this is a worldwide tradition. It's a very, very curious thing.
And there's this common trope too. You have King Judea of Sumeria saying that in a dream he was given this lapis lazuli, these tablets, saying that he has to build a temple with these specific astronomical alignments. You see the same thing with Pharaoh Tutmos in Egypt. You see the same thing with Aztec leaders, with Nebuchadnezzar. This sort of, you know, idea of you get this kind of download, or you have this divine connection, and then you must build this temple with these specific astronomical alignments. So I think that does point towards something having to do with the afterlife or some sort of ascension portal. I was even reading Ptolemy. Ptolemy, you know, is proto-astronomy, sort of like the in-between of like the astronomy we have today and, you know, whatever we had in the past. And he's writing in 100 AD in Roman times. And he's saying that the, you know, soul's ascension path is through Orion's belt. And
that's right. That's right. The leap is always to Orion's belt. That's another of the common factors in this idea around the world tour, because Orion stands by the Milky Way. From there, you're on the Milky Way. Then you make your journey.
So are you getting to some sort of more true proto-architecture to religion that involves these sort of oral traditions passed down that cuts across geography?
Look, I'll give you 2 examples. I've tried to explain it. It's best done graphically, really, for this to be understood. the phenomenon of precession is because the Earth is the viewing platform. I try to explain it in this way, from which we observe the stars, and because the Earth wobbles very slowly on its axis, and because that wobble unfolds a complete cycle in just under 26,000 years, the effect for us as observers is that the stars' orientation in the skies gradually changes, and the rising time of those stars in relation to the sun gradually changes, and the pole star gradually changes because the extended north pole of the Earth is wobbling, and will sometimes point at empty space and sometimes point at other stars. Ours is Polaris, but it's been other stars in the past. So this is a very complex, very sophisticated process which requires detailed observation. Now, as I've said, using precession and monumental architecture, the ancient Egyptians have built an enormous statement on the ground that speaks to the date that we call 10,500 BC, astronomically. It speaks to that date, about 12,500 years ago. Then jump over to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Look at Pillar 43 in Enclosure D. Look at the very interesting symbolism on that pillar, which includes a scorpion, which includes a vulture with outstretched arms, which includes a circle which we believe resembles the sun on the wing of that vulture. What we find is that is very persuasively an astronomical diagram of the sky at the summer solstice 12,500 years ago. And the sun is on the arm of Sagittarius, is the constellation that we think is represented by that vulture figure. The fact that we call it Sagittarius, other cultures can call it other things and symbolize it as other things. But the fact is that the shape of that constellation is what is reflected on that pillar. And using precession, it marks out, again, that same date that the ancient Egyptians called the first time. And that's interesting because Pillar 43 in Enclosure D has been dated to 11,600 years ago, but it's marking a date more than 1,000 years before that, 12,500 to 12,800 years ago. So that tells us that whoever built Göbekli Tepe, that previous date was as important to them as it was to the ancient Egyptians.
That's so fascinating.
I think so, yeah.
You write about this a little in your book, Talisman, with Robert Bauval, of this sort of quote-unquote organization that sort of hermetically transfers wisdom.
Yes, the passing down of knowledge over thousands of years does definitely involve some kind of organization. It's not going to happen randomly. It can happen in certain ways with stories. This is something that I came to understand way back in the late 1980s. And again, pay tribute to the work of others. Probably mentioned it to you before. Hamlet's Mill, Giorgio de Santillana.
MIT.
Not to be confused with the guy who presents Ancient Aliens. Giorgio de Santillana was a professor of history of science at MIT back in the 1960s. Hertha von Deschen, professor of the history of science at Frankfurt University. And you know, they have identified very ancient, very early knowledge of precession. I've been talking so much I've forgotten how we got on that point.
I brought up the organization.
Yes, the organization. So one way that ideas can be maintained is to embed those ideas in wonderful stories. Call them myths, if you like, which the story itself is so compelling that people will keep on repeating it down the ages. The storyteller no longer has to have knowledge that there is secret information embedded in that story. As long as the storyteller keeps on repeating the story through, the secret information will continue to be passed down. And later cultures, if they're open-minded and have their eyes and ears open, may be able to decipher that information. That's one way that information can be preserved across thousands of years. It's one of the reasons why myths is so important to me, without any organization involved. But I think very clear in the case of ancient Egypt, whether you call them the followers of Horus, whether you call them the souls of Pe and Nekhen, that these were secret societies which were entrusted with preserving information from what they call the first time and passing it down to future generations. And although it may seem like a bit of a stretch, I suggest that information was preserved for thousands and thousands of years and constantly passed down. And when the time was felt to be right, ancient Egypt was switched on. And of course, it was switched on entirely by ancient Egyptians. This was thousands of years after the information had reached them, and then was passed down through the generations and preserved. And it's hard to say why exactly the period of roughly 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago, to 2500 BC, 4,500 years ago, was chosen as the time to switch on the engine of ancient Egypt. But interestingly enough, that's exactly the same period that the engine of the Indus Valley civilization was switched on in what is now Pakistan and northern India. It's exactly the same time that the Yellow River civilization was switched on. This is found, this date, this sudden emergence of civilization, as it's called, coordinates with that date all around the world. It's not just ancient Egypt. So again, that makes me feel that there's something behind it, and that we're probably missing a very important part of the human story that's behind it. And that part of the human story goes back to the last ice age, in my view.
That's linking all of these civilizational cycles. And we think of the birthplace of kind of Western civilization as the Hellenic period in the Greeks, but in fact, you point out that there's a really clear through line from Plato to the ancient Egyptians. You have Solon, and the myth, and
well,
Timaeus
again,
and
the Atlantis story is I've had so much scorn poured on me by archaeologists for taking the Atlantis story seriously, because they're convinced that it's just a sort of political fable that Plato made up in order to establish certain philosophical points about how governments should work.
And this was for the audience because it was told at this festival that was, mythos or whatever. It was involved in sort of storytelling. I think mythology played a very there was more reality to a lot of what was transpired in these festivals.
That's right. I mean, you'll find the Atlantis story in the dialogues of Timaeus and Critias of Plato. And what the archaeologists say is that this is all just a fable. But in order to say that, they have to separate the Atlantis tradition from the global tradition of a great flood. That tradition is worldwide. There are roughly 200 flood myths from all around the world. There are very few parts of the world that don't have it. And there are many striking common features about those flood and cataclysm myths. It's one of the reasons we call our series Ancient Apocalypse, actually. And I regard the Atlantis tradition passed down to us by Plato as part of that.
Well, because it dates to 9,600 BC.
It's one of the very few traditions of a global flood that destroys a former civilization. As I say, there's up to 200 of them. It's one of the only ones which actually gives a date. And it gives that date because the Egyptian priests who read the hieroglyphs on the wall of the temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta to Solon and translated it for him, when he asked them, when did this happen? When did this place get destroyed? When was it submerged beneath the sea? They kind of matter-of-factly said, oh, well, 9,000 years ago. There's the date, because that was 600 BC. That's 9,000 years before 600 BC. That's 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago, give or take 24 years before our time. And that is meltwater pulse 1b. That is one of the big sea level rise incidents that took place at the end of the Ice Age. So for Plato to have stumbled upon that, just randomly picked that date as some sort of grand fiction, seems to me absurd.
Well, I think once mythology starts to comport with actual events, we have to stop calling it mythology.
I believe so. I believe so. And I think what Plato did was, I think he took elements of a very ancient tradition, which had been passed down to him by the ancient Egyptians. As he states in the Timaeus and Critias dialogues. He took elements of that were useful to him, and he left out other elements that weren't. But it's the connection to the worldwide tradition of a global flood that archaeologists completely ignore when they seek to dismiss the Atlantis tradition. And I think they need to take it on board. And rather than, excuse the language, rather than pissing on Plato, they should say, well, actually, what can we find from this? This is very interesting. Let's see if there's more to it than we imagine. Let's see if that date is significant in some way. And it is.
Well, I think a great other example would be the Peloponnesian War, where we said it was all mythology. It was all, the city of Troy did not exist. And then late 19th century, we figure out, oh, there actually was a city of Troy in modern Anatolia.
That's one of the great examples. And I think mythology needs to be used as a guide to
Absolutely.
the past, rather than kind of sneered at as fantasies made up by our primitive ancestors.
And the 19th century case with Troy, it was found by
Schliemann, yeah.
who was Heinrich von Schliemann, who was kind of this, he was a businessman, he was an outsider. Nobody in archaeology at the time respected him.
I know, yeah.
And they thought he was a fraud or
Some
whatever.
things never change.
Yeah, right. No,
archaeologists don't like outsiders.
Well, in the 19th century, you had all these guys. You had J.G. Fraser, who wrote The Golden Bough. You had all these anthropologists and guys who were contributing to the bedrock of what we now do, who kind of are more cut from your cloth than like this myopic paper-chasing academia cloth. There were these, you know, gentlemen journeyers who were very polymathic, and they had this wide view of, you know, what was going on historically. And they would come to these amazing conclusions. And now we just, I don't know, we have these kind of nitpicker, you know, people who...
As I've often said, I've learned a great deal from archaeology.
Yeah.
And there are many great archaeologists still today who are doing good work.
Yeah.
And often they are the archaeologists who are attacked by their colleagues.
Yeah.
But when it comes to criticism of archaeology, I find that archaeologists tend to circle the wagons around each other rather than deal with those criticisms face on. And so, speaking of archaeology as an institution rather than individual archaeologists, I would say that it appears to me that the mission of archaeology as an institution is the kind of mission of a vampire. They want to suck all the blood out of the ancient past. They want to drain the past of its blood, of its vitality, of its mystery, of everything that makes it worthwhile looking into, and leave this stuff that can just be counted and weighed and measured. They're so desperate to be seen as scientists that in order to be regarded as scientists, they've literally thrown the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes.
And we end up with this dry discipline, which is extremely unattractive in many ways and fails to do justice to the romance and the beauty and the mystery of the past. And that is why people are interested in the past. They don't want the weighing and measuring and counting to dominate the debate. There's a great place for weighing and measuring and counting, but for that to have a monopoly on our understanding of the past, that's a mistake. The past is too big a subject for one small discipline of scholars who include a very vocal subgroup who wish to destroy any alternative ideas. It's wrong for such a small group to have this death grip on the past and to claim that they're the only ones who have a right to speak of the past.